The Democrats were dealt a very difficult Senate map in 2024, and with prospects looking ever more grim in Montana and Ohio, and with West Virginia essentially being an automatic flip for the GOP, Democrats are now looking towards Republican-leaning states in order to seize potential pickup opportunities. So in today's video, we're going to talk about the prospects of Texas and Florida for Democrats, why the Democrats are now looking at these states, and whether or not these are realistic pickup opportunities for the party in November. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So this is the Senate map as I currently see it. The Republicans at about 50 seats, and again, I've highlighted Texas and Florida out just for the sake of talking about them, but obviously if we give both of those states to the Republicans, they're at 52 seats, the Democrats are at 48. So right off the bat, this is the map that the Democrats are working with these two states out of the equation. So first, we're going to talk about Texas, because this is the state that I think, more so than Florida, has more of a pickup opportunity for the Democrats. And Texas is certainly no easy territory for Democrats, but Democrats have consistently done better in their overall percentage of the vote on average over the past 15 years or so. And it's one of the reasons why they're looking at Texas. And of course, every big cycle, we always talk about the prospect of Texas flipping blue. And the reason for that is because Texas is trending in the Democrats' direction. If we take a look at where Texas stands so far, currently Ted Cruz is up in the polling average by just 3.4% in FiveThirtyEight, 5 points in RCP, with an overall average of Cruz up by 4.2. That's incredibly close, and that's certainly closer than the margin of Trump versus Harris, which I believe at this point, Trump is up 6 or 7 points over Kamala Harris. So it seems like at this point in time, Ted Cruz is certainly going to run behind Donald Trump. The real question is, if Donald Trump has a surprisingly close victory in the state of Texas, only winning by 2 or 3 points, is Ted Cruz going to be carried over the finish line, or is there potential for a Democratic upset? Now, right off the bat, I'll say that Ted Cruz has outraised his Democratic opponent. That's certainly a good sign, considering in most states, Republicans are not outraising Democrats, but certainly Texas is an exception. Texas is a very red state. I think Democrats are putting some money towards this state now because I think they're ever more seeing potential here. But ultimately, I don't think they'd be foolish enough to put a large sum of money in this state. And again, a lot of this could be coming from in-state donors, big city liberals, etc. But they're not being competitive in fundraising because I think they still acknowledge that this state certainly leans towards Republicans. And we take a look at the Axios article I put up earlier. This is really just a Hail Mary attempt to try and flip the Senate because things are looking bad in Montana. John Tester's down by 5 points in the average. Ohio, Republicans are putting a lot of money in the final stretch, and it seems like the polls are narrowing. Again, Sherrod Brown is still leading in the polls there, but at the end of the day, if Donald Trump is carrying Ohio by 7-8 points, I think it's very unlikely that somebody like Brown would be able to hold on. But again, you never know. We're obviously going to revisit that race several times before the election. But with those two states almost out of the question, that's why Democrats are getting desperate, because if Sherrod Brown doesn't win Ohio, Democrats don't capture the Senate. The only way they could capture the Senate is if they potentially picked up a state like Texas or Florida. And honestly, they would need to pick up both if Montana and Ohio flip red. So that's why it really is such a Hail Mary attempt, because it's very, very unlikely, if not almost impossible, for Democrats to be able to pull that off unless they have an incredible night in November. And there would have to be a pretty big polling miss, both nationally and in statewide polls. But again, we'll focus on Texas first. Ted Cruz is certainly not a strong candidate. He's extremely divisive. He's somebody that's disliked by Democrats and Republicans. And I think some Republicans still have residual disdain for Ted Cruz back from the primaries in 2016. He famously didn't endorse Donald Trump at the 2016 RNC. And that certainly didn't put him in the good graces of the party. And then eventually he bent the knee later on. So Ted Cruz has also just rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Personality-wise, some argue he's not a very likable character. And he gets himself caught up in a lot of controversy. He's one of those Republicans that's always at the center of the news cycle. And before Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, there was Ted Cruz. He was in that Tea Party wing, and during the Obama administration, he was a very vocal and controversial figure. So if we go back to his last performance in 2018, Ted Cruz only won re-election by around 2.5 points. This is a lot closer than the polls were saying. Ted Cruz was up 5 or 6 points on election day in the polls, and ultimately Beto ended up getting a surprisingly good showing in these urban and suburban counties that have been swinging the state of Texas so far to the left. Because if we take a look at the rural counties, Democrats are still only getting, 12% of the vote, 16% of the vote on average, 20% of the vote. Rural Texas is some of the reddest geography in the entire country. And yet, Texas is increasingly getting bluer because it is increasingly becoming a suburban, urban state. Counties like Tarrant County, for example, Williamson, Hayes, obviously Harris County, San Antonio, they're all growing pretty rapidly in population, and there is a blue shift going on in these counties as well. So not only are these counties growing and their voting patterns are staying the same, which would still favor Democrats, they're growing and they're getting more Democratic. And if that rate continues, I'm very doubtful that rural Texas will be able to keep the state in its Republican-leaning categorization. I think there will be a time, if this continues, that Texas will be the new Florida, will be that purple state. And it could happen sooner than you think. Again, if somehow Colin Allred wins in Texas, that would be an earth-shattering moment in politics, because that would be the first Democrat to win an election in Texas statewide since 1994. And of course, that would immediately signal huge alarm bells in the RNC, because that would mean that a Democrat for president could also win the state. Now, as it stands right now, Kamala Harris will not win Texas. I'm pretty confident in that. She'll lose by, at minimum, a few points, 3 or 4. But this state is increasingly shifting to the left. In 2020, Donald Trump only won Texas by 5.6%. On the same exact ballot that John Cornyn, the incumbent Republican senator, won his re-election bid by almost 10 points. So there is a distinction Texas voters are making between Donald Trump and other Republicans. And there still are Republicans like Greg Abbott that can hold pretty respectable margins in the suburbs. They're able to win places like Collin and Denton County by comfortable margins. And these are counties that have been leftward trending pretty rapidly. Beto almost won Collin and Denton County. He was about 7-8 points away. And the growth in this area has been massive. So that's really the Texas problem for Republicans, is that even if Ted Cruz somehow hangs on this time around, he probably should retire before the next time his term is up in 2030, because at that point, the demographics in Texas, the political landscape could almost ensure his defeat, because we have no idea how Texas is going to vote in 2028. That could be a huge year for Democrats. If Donald Trump wins in 2024 and say you have a weak Republican nominee like J.D. Vance, you certainly could see Texas up for grabs for Democrats. So it's really a ticking time bomb until Republicans figure out a strategy to improve in these suburban counties and start to take back territory in places like Dallas, places like Houston, and even Austin, because I think the Austin area in particular has been the most alarming, because it's the fastest growing and it's the fastest leftward trending for the GOP. So that's why I've said I think Texas would be more likely of a flip than Florida. Ted Cruz is not popular. Texas is leftward trending. Florida is rightward trending. And while I don't think either of these flips are very probable, I think if I had to bet, I would say Texas would be more likely to flip than Florida. Again, even despite its history of consistently voting for Republicans since 94, I think that trend-wise, demographic-wise, and just Ted Cruz being an unpopular candidate, I think it would be the most likely to flip. But obviously, I don't want to mince words here. I'm not saying Texas is going to flip. I don't think either of these states are going to go to the Democrats. But if either of them were to, I think it would be Texas. So that's why I'm putting Texas in the lean Republican category. I think at the end of the day, Ted Cruz will probably hang on by anywhere between 3 to 5. But at this point in time with the polls, if there is a polling miss in Democrats' direction, Ted Cruz might only hang on by a point or two, which would be terrifying for Republicans, because even if Texas doesn't flip, that just means Texas is just one cycle away from flipping towards the Democrats. And who knows? Texas could be the new California, and once it flips, it doesn't flip back. So obviously we'll have to see how that pans out. But now we'll move on to the state of Florida. This state, I'm certainly more confident about the Republicans' chances of victory here. If we go to the polling here in Florida, Rick Scott is somebody who has famously won his elections by incredibly narrow margins. In 2018, he was able to beat incumbent Senator Bill Nelson by 0.1% in a blue wave year, which that really goes to show you that Florida was trending in a different direction. When him and DeSantis both won, I think it signaled that Florida was no longer this purple bellwether state. It was now a rightward trending state since 2016. So the polls currently have him beating his Democratic challenger by an average of about 4.5 points. So similar to the Ted Cruz average, but dissimilar to Ted Cruz. He has not been losing in any poll that's really been relevant. I mean, you do have this Democratic internal from 2023 where he's down by 1, but all of the recent polls have Rick Scott up by 2 points, 1 point, 8 points. So, you know, the average is out to about 4 points. And interestingly enough, in Texas, you did have Colin Allred actually lead in a poll in Morning Consult very recently, earlier this month. So, bit of a different dynamic here. It seems like Rick Scott is sort of getting stronger in the home stretch. Ted Cruz appears to be more vulnerable, because if we go back to June, for instance, you know, Ted Cruz is up by 9 points. He's up by 13 points. He's up by 10. He's up by 6. Now it seems like the average is he's up by only about 3. So another huge difference between Ted Cruz and Rick Scott. Rick Scott is a formidable fundraiser. He's a very good candidate. And I think this is going to be the first election in his career statewide where he's not winning by just a point or a point and a half or just by a small little percentage. Because I think Donald Trump probably wins Florida by 5 to 7. I think Rick Scott probably runs pretty similar to Donald Trump. I think the coalition will be a little bit different. I think Rick Scott would probably do better than Donald Trump in a place like Jacksonville. That's sort of an ancestral Republican area that's been trending left. And I think Donald Trump would probably do better with Hispanics in a place like Miami-Dade. So I think both candidates will probably run about even. I just think Rick Scott's going to do better in ancestral Republican suburbs where Donald Trump probably isn't going to do as well. Duval County, for example. I think Harris probably wins Duval County again. I think Rick Scott could potentially win there. And of course, around Tampa Bay, similar story there. I think you probably would see Rick Scott win Pinellas County. Trump probably wins Pinellas County as well, but I think Miami is going to see the bigger ticket split, because I think you're going to have a decent amount of Hispanic voters voting for Trump that also vote for the Democratic nominee for Senate. So this is a pattern we also saw back in 2018. If we pull up the results between the governor's race and the race for Senate, Rick Scott had better numbers in places like Duval County. Andrew Gillum won Duval by over 4 points. Rick Scott only lost Duval County by almost 2 points. So like I said, I think Rick Scott's going to do better in these areas. I think he's going to do better in some of these suburban counties where I think Donald Trump is going to continue to do worse. But I think Donald Trump's real key to Florida is Miami-Dade. The fact that Miami-Dade has swung so massively towards the right is one of the reasons why you're seeing Florida voting for Republicans by safe margins now, and that's what we saw in the midterms. You had both Rubio and DeSantis win this area by a comfortable margin. So at the end of the day, I don't think either of these states are going to go to Democrats. I see why Democrats would be potentially desperate to hold on to these states, because they really don't have any other options. I mean, you take a look at the rest of the Senate map, there's really no other place they could potentially seize a flip. You do have some Democrats talking about the special election in Nebraska, which I'll certainly talk about, because you do have an independent who has refused the Democratic endorsement, but who I suspect if he somehow did win in some sort of miraculous circumstance, I do think he would caucus with the Democrats. But you don't really see a lot of attention going to that race, but we will talk about it at some point. Democrats really don't have any other options. They're not going to flip a state like Indiana. They're not going to flip Tennessee, Mississippi, so on and so forth. None of these other states are really up for grabs. And John Curtis is basically a Romney-type Republican, so there's no potential for some crazy pickup in Utah. So ultimately, I think Democrats really are stuck where they are. Their best hope is that they can win Ohio and then maybe call it even. They somehow, by some miracle, are able to hold on to Montana, but I think this is very unlikely. And that's why you see Democrats getting desperate, in my opinion, and going for places like Texas and Florida. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.